On a cold night beside the Danube frontier, the most powerful man in the Roman world lay dying in a military camp. Beyond the walls, watchfires trembled in the darkness. Horses shifted in the mud. Soldiers stood beneath a sky that seemed endless, waiting for news from a room they would never enter. Inside, Marcus Aurelius had almost nothing that looked like victory. No marble throne, no cheering crowd, no triumphal music, only a narrow bed, the sound of distant armor, and the knowledge that his final breath was close. For nearly 2 decades, he had ruled an empire stretching from the rainy hills of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast to the mountains beyond Syria. He had commanded armies, judged senators, survived plague, rebellion, invasion, and the deaths of children. He had been called Caesar, Augustus, father of the country, conqueror of Germans and Sarmatians. Yet in the private pages he wrote for himself, he returned again and again to a simpler truth. Power disappears, fame fades, the body weakens, and every human being, emperor or slave, must eventually surrender to nature. Now nature had come for him. Near the dying emperor waited his son Commodus, young, handsome, and already raised to share the imperial title. To the soldiers outside, the transfer of power appeared secure. Rome had an heir. The dynasty would continue. But history knew what Marcus could not. The son who inherited his empire would not inherit his discipline. The ruler remembered as the philosopher emperor would be followed by a ruler whose name became a symbol of excess, fear, and decay. Later generations would look back at the death of Marcus Aurelius as the end of an age. One ancient historian would describe the change as a descent from a kingdom of gold into one of iron and rust. And so the final mystery of Marcus Aurelius begins not with the wisdom he wrote, but with the world he left behind. How could a man who warned himself against vanity become the center of an imperial cult? How could a philosopher devoted to justice spend much of his reign at war? How could an emperor who understood the danger of uncontrolled desire place the future of Rome in the hands of Commodus? And why did private notes, written in military camps and never intended for publication, survive when palaces, armies, and entire dynasties vanished? To understand that, we must go back to a Rome that still believed its greatest dangers were behind it. Marcus was born on the 26th of April in the year 121, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian. His original name was Marcus Annius Verus, though Roman names could change with adoption, inheritance, and political fortune. He entered the world not as a prince, but as the child of a wealthy and respected senatorial family. His family's roots reached back to Hispania, the Roman provinces of the Iberian Peninsula. By the time of his birth, however, the Annii were firmly established among Rome's elite. They possessed wealth, estates, political connections, and the kind of reputation that opened doors before a child was old enough to know those doors existed. But privilege did not protect Marcus from loss. His father died when Marcus was still very young. The boy was raised largely under the influence of his mother, Domitia Lucilla, and his paternal grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus. His mother came from immense wealth connected to brickworks that supplied material for Rome's constant building. Yet the image Marcus later preserved of her was not one of luxury. In his private reflections, he remembered her piety, generosity, and dislike of cruelty. The memory mattered because Marcus would spend his life surrounded by splendor while trying not to be owned by it. The Rome of his childhood was a city of overwhelming contrasts. Marble temples stood above crowded streets. Senators traveled in dignity, while laborers carried stone through dust and noise. Slaves filled households, workshops, farms, mines, and public buildings. Grain ships crossed the Mediterranean to feed a population that could turn restless. When supplies failed, public games celebrated imperial generosity through racing, spectacle, and blood. At the center of this world stood Hadrian. Hadrian was restless, intelligent, suspicious, and deeply interested in Greek culture. He traveled through the provinces, inspected armies, built monuments, strengthened frontiers, and left his mark from Britain to Athens. He was also a ruler capable of severity and political fear. The empire under him could appear peaceful from a distance, but peace depended on discipline, money, and the constant possibility of force. According to later tradition, Hadrian noticed the young Marcus and admired his honesty. A famous story claims the emperor jokingly altered the boy's family name Verus, meaning true, into Verissimus, meaning most true. The tale comes through sources that are not always reliable, so it should be treated carefully. But the story endured because it matched the man Marcus later seemed to become: serious, truthful, and uncomfortable with deception even when deception was useful. As a child, Marcus was drawn into the ceremonies of Roman public life. He became associated with the Salii, an ancient priesthood of Mars whose members carried sacred shields through the streets in ritual processions. The sight would have been unforgettable: priests in archaic dress, music echoing between buildings, weapons lifted in honor of a god whose presence Rome never allowed itself to forget. War, religion, and government were not separate worlds in Rome. They were threads of the same fabric. Marcus learned this before he learned philosophy. His education was designed for a future aristocrat. Tutors taught him Latin and Greek literature, law, music, geometry, public speaking, and the traditions expected of a Roman nobleman. Rhetoric mattered especially. In the Roman elite, a speech could defend a governor, destroy an enemy, calm a crowd, or persuade the Senate to accept what power had already decided. One of Marcus's most important teachers was Marcus Cornelius Fronto, a celebrated orator from North Africa. Their surviving letters reveal a relationship warmer and more vulnerable than the cold marble image of an emperor might suggest. Marcus worried about health, study, exhaustion, and family. Fronto praised him, corrected him, teased him, and tried to keep him devoted to rhetoric. But another force was beginning to pull Marcus away. Philosophy offered something rhetoric could not. Rhetoric taught a man how to win an argument. Philosophy asked whether the argument was worth winning. Among the teachers Marcus later thanked was Diognetus, who encouraged him to reject superstition, avoid empty displays, and desire a simple life. He remembered learning to sleep on a basic camp bed and to live with less comfort than his position allowed. He studied under Apollonius of Chalcedon, Sextus of Corinthia, and other philosophers whose examples impressed him as much as their words. Most influential of all was Junius Rusticus. Rusticus did not flatter Marcus. He taught him to distrust showy language, to read carefully, to correct his character, and to avoid performing virtue for applause. Through Rusticus, Marcus encountered the teachings of Epictetus, the former slave whose philosophy insisted that freedom does not begin with political power. It begins with judgment. Epictetus had taught that some things are within our control and others are not. Our choices, values, and responses belong to us. Fortune, reputation, illness, death, and the actions of others do not. Confusing these categories produces fear and misery. Understanding them opens the possibility of inner freedom. For an ordinary person, this was demanding. For a future emperor, it was almost revolutionary. Marcus was being prepared to command others, yet philosophy told him that the hardest person to command would always be himself. He began to dress more simply. He wanted the rough cloak associated with philosophers. He reduced the softness of his bed. He trained himself to endure discomfort. Some members of his family worried that he was taking the life too far, turning discipline into severity. This tension never completely left him. Marcus admired self-control, but he also possessed a body that seems to have been frequently unwell. His letters mention pain, weakness, poor sleep, and the strain of work. Later traditions speak of chest and stomach problems. He would eventually rely on medicine from the famous physician Galen, though the exact nature of his illnesses remains uncertain. The young man who wanted to master pain would spend much of his life negotiating with it. Then, when Marcus was 16, the future that others had designed for him suddenly changed. Emperor Hadrian had no surviving son. Like several emperors before him, he needed to create an heir through adoption. His first choice was Lucius Aelius Caesar, a handsome aristocrat with political promise but fragile health. Hadrian arranged for the young Marcus to be engaged to Aelius's daughter, Sionia Fabia, bringing Marcus closer to the imperial succession. But on the first day of the year 138, Lucius Aelius died. Rome's future was again uncertain. Hadrian was old, ill, and increasingly desperate to control what would happen after him. He selected Antoninus, a respected senator in his early 50s, as his new heir. But the adoption came with a condition. Antoninus must adopt two young men in turn. One was Lucius, the son of the dead Aurelius. The other was Marcus. With a legal ceremony, a family arrangement became an imperial plan. Marcus entered the household of Antoninus and received a new name. He was no longer merely the promising son of an aristocratic family. He had become a possible ruler of the world, and he did not welcome the news with joy. The palace offered everything Rome considered desirable: servants, gardens, libraries, fine clothing, the attention of senators, the certainty that every word would be remembered by someone who hoped to benefit from it. Marcus reportedly moved into the imperial residence with reluctance. Whether every detail of that tradition is true, the reluctance itself is believable. He understood that imperial life was not freedom. It was exposure. A prince could no longer be tired in private, angry without consequence, careless without witnesses, or trusting without danger. The court watched him. Hadrian watched him. And beyond the palace walls, an empire of tens of millions unknowingly depended on decisions that had not yet been made. Hadrian died in July of 138. Antoninus succeeded him and soon received the name Pius, perhaps because of his loyalty to Hadrian's memory, perhaps because of his conduct during the difficult transition, or perhaps for several reasons that later tradition compressed into a single virtue. Marcus was now the adopted son of the emperor. His earlier engagement to Sionia Fabia was ended. Instead, he was promised to Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus Pius, and Faustina the Elder. The change was political, but it would become personal. Marcus and Faustina married in 145. Ancient imperial marriages were rarely private matters. A wedding joined households, secured legitimacy, and created expectations. Rome needed heirs. The Senate needed stability. The army needed to know that the future would not be decided by civil war. Marcus and Faustina would have many children, though ancient records do not always agree on the exact number. At least 13 are usually counted, and perhaps more. Several died in infancy or childhood. Their household, for all its privilege, knew the repeated grief that was common in the ancient world. One child would fall ill. Another would be mourned. A new birth would bring hope. Then sickness would return. Marcus wrote about accepting the order of nature, but philosophy did not erase sorrow. It gave sorrow a language. It did not make him less human. It reminded him that being human meant loving what could not be kept. Antoninus Pius ruled for more than 20 years, and compared with what came later, his reign seemed almost unnaturally calm. He rarely left Italy. The frontiers required attention, and conflicts still occurred, but the center of the empire remained stable. Administration continued. Roads carried officials and tax revenues. Ports received grain, wine, oil, marble, timber, and luxury goods. Roman law reached into disputes between cities, families, soldiers, merchants, freed people, and slaves. For Marcus, these years were an apprenticeship in power. He served as consul, took part in government, received tribunician authority, and sat beside Antoninus in judgment. The older emperor showed him that ruling was often less dramatic than history makes it appear. It meant reading petitions, listening to legal arguments, appointing provincial officials, responding to disasters, balancing the pride of the Senate against the needs of the army, deciding which traditions mattered and which could bend. Antoninus was patient, restrained, and difficult to provoke. Marcus later remembered his steadiness with admiration. He praised his father by adoption for working without complaint, accepting correction, resisting flattery, and enjoying comfort without becoming dependent on it. These were not abstract virtues. They were lessons observed at close range. Marcus saw how an emperor entered a room, how he allowed others to speak, how he refused unnecessary expense, how he preserved dignity without theatrical cruelty, how he remained the most important person in the empire while behaving as though importance did not require constant display. But calm years can hide dangerous weaknesses. The empire Marcus would inherit was vast, wealthy, and impressive. It was also expensive to defend. Its borders stretched across thousands of miles. In Britain, soldiers guarded Hadrian's Wall. Along the Rhine and Danube, forts faced peoples who traded with Rome, served in Roman units, demanded subsidies, crossed boundaries, and formed shifting alliances. In the east, the Parthian Empire remained a powerful rival. In North Africa and Egypt, grain production was essential to urban life. At sea, Ships depended on weather, order, and protected routes. Rome looked permanent because its machinery usually worked. But machinery can fail in several places at once. Marcus continued his studies while preparing for rule. His correspondence with Fronto shows a man caught between duty and the desire for intellectual life. Fronto wanted elegant language and mastery of Latin expression. Marcus increasingly wanted moral clarity. At one point, he wrote of reading the Stoic Aristo and feeling almost painfully awakened. The experience made the performance of arguing both sides of a question seem morally dangerous. What was the value of learning to make falsehood sound persuasive? What happened to the soul of a man who treated truth as a game? Fronto did not share all of his pupils' enthusiasm. To a professional orator, philosophy could appear too absolute, too dismissive of practical communication. The disagreement did not destroy their bond. It revealed the two lives competing within Marcus. One life belonged to books, reflection, and the search for wisdom. The other belonged to ceremony, law, family, and the approaching throne. He would never be allowed to choose only one. The most famous work associated with Marcus Aurelius did not yet exist. What we now call the Meditations was written much later, in fragments, during years of war and strain. It was not a book composed for readers. It had no polished introduction, no final argument, and no title chosen for publication. The Greek phrase often used for it means something like, to himself. That private quality is the source of its power. Marcus was not presenting himself as a sage who had conquered anger, fear, and vanity. He was reminding himself because he had not conquered them. He repeated lessons because he forgot them. He urged himself to rise from bed because he wanted to remain there. He warned himself against irritation because people irritated him. He wrote about death because death frightened, surrounded, or exhausted him. The pages are not the voice of a man floating above ordinary weakness. They are the record of a man wrestling with weakness while millions called him master. During the long reign of Antoninus Pius, that struggle remained mostly hidden. Marcus attended public duties, raised a family, studied law and philosophy, and waited. Waiting itself became a kind of test. An heir could not know when the emperor would die. He could not appear impatient. He could not withdraw. He could not build an independent court so powerful that it looked threatening. He had to prepare for authority without seeming eager to possess it. Marcus performed this role for more than 2 decades. As the years passed, Antoninus grew older. His health weakened gradually. In early March of 161, the emperor was at his estate at Lorium, west of Rome. Ancient accounts describe him eating alpine cheese at dinner, becoming ill in the night, and developing a fever. The details may have been shaped by later storytelling, but the end itself was calm. Antoninus gave the password for the night watch as equanimity. Then he turned as if to sleep. He died on the 7th of March. Marcus was nearly 40 years old. He had spent most of his adult life preparing for this moment. The Senate was ready to confirm him. The palace was ready to obey him. The machinery of succession moved quickly. But Marcus made an unexpected decision. He refused to rule alone. He insisted that Lucius, the other adopted son chosen by Hadrian's plan, share the imperial title with him. Lucius became Lucius Aurelius Verus. For the first time in Roman history, 2 men held formally equal imperial power at the same time. Marcus was older, more experienced, and more respected. He could almost certainly have kept sole authority. Instead, he honored the arrangement created by adoption and made Lucius his colleague. The choice has been interpreted in different ways. Perhaps Marcus believed fairness required it. Perhaps he wanted to avoid resentment and rivalry. Perhaps he understood that the empire was too large for one man. Perhaps he saw Lucius as family and trusted him. All may have been true. The new reign began with gestures of continuity. Antoninus Pius was deified. Coins announced harmony between the emperors. The soldiers received the customary donative. The Senate was treated with respect. Rome saw 2 rulers, one serious and philosophical, the other younger and more drawn to pleasure. Later writers often exaggerated the contrast. Lucius Verus was portrayed as indulgent, fond of banquets, entertainment, racing, and actors, while Marcus was presented as disciplined and austere. Some of this may reflect moral storytelling rather than balanced history. Lucius could enjoy luxury and still perform political duties. Marcus could value discipline and still participate in imperial spectacle. Yet the difference between them was real enough to become part of their public image. They were brothers by adoption. They were sons-in-law as well, because Lucius married Marcus's daughter Lucilla. They were equal in title, but no one doubted which of them carried the deeper weight of government. Then, almost immediately, the calm inherited from Antoninus Pius began to break. Far to the east, the King of Kings made his move. The Parthian ruler Vologases IV invaded Armenia, the kingdom that stood between Roman and Parthian influence. Armenia was not merely a distant mountain land. It was a strategic doorway. Whoever controlled its throne gained leverage across the eastern frontier. A Roman force marched to respond. It was destroyed. The governor of Cappadocia, Marcus Sedatius Severianus, entered Armenia after being encouraged by a supposed prophet. Near Elegia, his army was trapped. According to the surviving account, Severianus killed himself, and an entire legion was lost or shattered. At almost the same time, Roman forces in Syria suffered defeat. News traveled west along imperial roads. The new reign had barely begun, and Rome's eastern defenses were collapsing. The age of preparation was over. Marcus Aurelius, who had been taught to govern his own reactions, now had to govern an empire reacting to fear. The first great test of Marcus's reign came from a direction he could not ignore and a battlefield he would not personally command. Lucius Verus was sent east. The decision made practical and political sense. Two emperors now existed. One could remain near Rome and maintain the government, while the other represented imperial authority at the front. Lucius left Italy in 162, traveling toward Syria through Greece and Asia Minor. His journey was not hurried. Ancient critics accused him of lingering in pleasure, falling ill at Canusium, enjoying entertainments, and allowing others to fight in his name. These stories may contain truth, but they were also written by authors who preferred a moral contrast between the disciplined Marcus and the luxurious Lucius. What matters is that Lucius reached the east, established his court at Antioch, and oversaw a war conducted by capable generals. Among them were Statius Priscus, Marcius Verus, and Avidius Cassius. Their task was enormous. The Parthian Empire did not resemble Rome. Its power rested on a network of kings, noble families, cities, cavalry forces, and regional loyalties spread across Mesopotamia and Iran. Parthian horse archers could strike at distance. Armored cavalry could break infantry formations. The eastern landscape punished armies that moved without water, supply, and local knowledge. Rome responded with the method that had built its empire. Reinforcements marched east. Units were transferred across provinces. Roads and depots fed the advance. Discipline was restored. Armenia was invaded. Its capital, Artaxata, was captured, and a new city was built nearby. Rome installed a friendly king, Sohaemus, on the Armenian throne. Then the war moved deeper. Roman armies crossed into Mesopotamia. They occupied important cities. In 165, the forces of Avidius Cassius advanced upon the great twin centers on the Tigris, Seleucia and Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon, the royal capital, was captured and burned. Seleucia was sacked under circumstances that ancient accounts dispute. Roman propaganda celebrated overwhelming victory. Titles followed. Lucius was hailed as Armeniacus, Parthicus, and Medicus. Marcus accepted some of the same honors, though he had remained in the west. To Rome, the result looked magnificent. The eastern enemy had been humbled. The lost honor of the opening disasters had been restored. The co-emperors could present themselves as partners in victory. But the soldiers were bringing home something no triumph could display. Disease had appeared among the armies in the east. Its exact origin and identity remained debated. It may have been smallpox, but modern certainty is impossible. The physician Galen, who witnessed parts of the epidemic, described fever, diarrhea, inflammation of the throat, and a skin eruption that could become dry, rough, or ulcerated. Some recovered. Many did not. The sickness followed movement. Legions marched west. Merchants traveled. Ships entered ports. Messengers changed horses at stations along the imperial roads. What made Rome powerful also made Rome vulnerable. The same network that carried orders, taxes, grain, soldiers, and news carried infection across continents. By 166, disease was spreading through the empire. Later generations called it the Antonine Plague, after the imperial family name Antoninus. The ancient world did not understand viruses or immunity. People interpreted epidemic disease through environment, divine anger, poisoned air, fate, and rumor. Temples received prayers. Physicians offered treatments. Families isolated the sick when they could. The poor often had no place to go. In crowded cities, death became part of the daily soundscape. Doors opened for bodies. Funeral workers struggled to keep pace. Shops lost owners. Workshops lost laborers. Farms lost hands at harvest. Army units lost experienced soldiers who could not be quickly replaced. The scale of mortality is uncertain, and ancient numbers are often unreliable. Some modern estimates are very high, others are more cautious. What cannot be doubted is that the epidemic returned in waves and damaged the empire for years. Marcus could command governors to act. He could reduce certain expenses, arrange burials, adjust recruitment, and maintain grain supply. He could not command the disease to stop. This was precisely the kind of event Stoic philosophy forced him to confront. A ruler was responsible for action, but not guaranteed success. He could choose discipline, justice, patience, and courage. He could not choose whether nature would reward them. The philosophy was no longer a subject discussed with tutors in a quiet room. It was becoming a method of survival. In October of 166, Lucius returned to Rome. The two emperors celebrated a triumph together. Their chariots moved through streets filled with ceremony. Captives, spoils, soldiers, standards, and images of conquered places proclaimed victory. The imperial family appeared united. Marcus's sons Commodus and the younger Marcus Annius Verus were given the title Caesar, marking them as heirs. For a moment, Rome could believe that danger had passed. The East had been secured. The emperors had triumphed. The dynasty had sons. But even during the celebration, the plague remained among the population, and the northern frontier was beginning to fail. Beyond the Danube lived many peoples whom Roman writers grouped under broad and shifting names: Marcomanni, Quadi, Azages, Vandals, Langobardi, and others. They were not a single united nation waiting to invade Rome. They had different leaders, interests, rivalries, and relationships with the empire. Some traded across the frontier. Some served Rome. Some depended on Roman payments. Some were themselves under pressure from groups moving behind them. The Danube was a border, but it was not a wall separating two sealed worlds. Goods crossed it. People crossed it. Information crossed it. So did fear. The movement of populations in Central and Eastern Europe placed increasing pressure on communities near the Roman frontier. Groups sought land, safety, wealth, or advantage. Roman weakness in one region encouraged demands in another. Troops had been moved east for the Parthian War. Disease reduced manpower. Negotiations grew tense. In 166 or 167, thousands of warriors crossed the Danube. Roman forces repelled some of them, and diplomatic meetings followed. Envoys promised peace. Leaders blamed one another. The frontier seemed temporarily manageable. It was not. Marcus and Lucius prepared to travel north. Rome now faced a crisis unlike the clean victory displayed in the triumph. The enemy was not a distant king whose capital could be burned. It was a shifting storm along hundreds of miles of river and mountain. The emperors reached Aquileia, the great northern Italian city near the routes leading toward the Danube. Plague struck the region heavily. Physicians, officers, servants, and soldiers moved through a landscape where military urgency and epidemic fear overlapped. Galen, summoned to imperial service, joined them for a time. He later returned to Rome, where he became physician to members of the imperial household. His writings preserve rare clinical glimpses of the disease, though they cannot answer every modern question. The first northern expedition achieved no final solution. The emperors returned toward Rome, then set out again. Early in 169, while traveling in northern Italy, Lucius Verus became suddenly ill. He died near Altinum. Ancient sources offered different possibilities, including stroke and disease. Later gossip even accused Marcus or Faustina of involvement, but such tales are not supported by reliable evidence. Lucius was 38. Marcus had lost his colleague, adoptive brother, and son-in-law. The experiment of equal co-rule ended after 8 years. Lucius was deified. Public grief followed the expected forms. His victories remained part of imperial memory. His widow Lucilla, Marcus's daughter, would later remarry a prominent senator and remain dangerously close to power. Marcus now ruled alone. There was no relief in it. The plague had not ended. The northern frontier was unstable. The imperial treasury was strained, and the peoples beyond the Danube had learned that Rome could bleed. In 170, the crisis became catastrophe. A coalition led by the Marcomanni and Quadi broke through Roman defenses. A Roman army suffered a severe defeat. The invaders moved south with alarming speed, crossed the Alps, destroyed Opitergium, and reached Aquileia. For the first time in centuries, Italy itself faced a major invasion from the north. The psychological shock was immense. Rome had spent generations projecting danger outward. Wars happened in Armenia, Britain, Dacia, Africa, or along distant rivers. Italy was the secure center, the land from which governors departed and triumphs returned. Now smoke rose within reach of the heartland. Aquileia was besieged. People fled. Rumors raced ahead of facts. The philosopher emperor could no longer treat the Danube as one frontier among many. If the line broke completely, roads led toward the cities of northern Italy and beyond them toward Rome. Marcus needed soldiers, money, weapons, animals, food, and time. He lacked all of them. So the emperor began to strip the palace of its treasures. At the Forum of Trajan, an extraordinary public sale was held. Imperial robes, cups, statues, paintings, jewels, furniture, and objects associated with the luxury of the court were offered for purchase. The sale continued for weeks, perhaps longer according to later accounts. The meaning was unmistakable. Marcus would not impose every cost of war upon the population while the palace remained untouched. The objects of power would be turned into the means of defense. Some buyers later tried to return what they had purchased. Marcus reportedly allowed them to keep the items and did not punish them. Whether every story is exact or polished by admiration, the larger fact remains. Imperial valuables were sold during the emergency. Recruitment widened. Gladiators entered military service. Slaves were enlisted under special conditions. Bandits and others on the margins may have been offered a place in the war effort. Foreign auxiliaries joined Roman formations. The empire gathered strength from wherever strength could still be found. Critics joked that Marcus was taking away the people's entertainments by turning gladiators into soldiers. The joke revealed how strange the crisis felt. Men trained to fight for spectacle were now needed to fight for Italy. Marcus left the ceremonial world of Rome and moved toward the frontier. He was not a young conqueror seeking glory. He was nearly 50, often unwell, burdened by administration, and drawn by temperament toward books rather than battle. Yet he went. The next years would transform him from a palace-trained ruler into an emperor of winter camps, muddy roads, military councils, and unfinished thoughts written by lamplight. He had spent his youth learning that hardship should be accepted without complaint. Now hardship became his kingdom. The Roman frontier along the Danube was not a single line drawn cleanly across a map. It was a living system of forts, watchtowers, roads, supply depots, river patrols, civilian settlements, and alliances. Legions occupied major bases. Auxiliary units guarded smaller positions. Merchants followed the soldiers. Families settled near camps. Veterans received land. Local communities supplied food, animals, labor, and intelligence. When this system held, Rome could appear invincible. When it broke, every weakness connected to another. The army needed grain, but disease had reduced labor. The forts needed reinforcements, but troops had been sent east. The treasury needed taxes, but war damaged the provinces that paid them. The emperor needed reliable allies beyond the river, but those allies feared their neighbors and doubted Rome's strength. Marcus established himself near the military zone and began the slow work of rebuilding control. Ancient sources do not allow every movement to be reconstructed with certainty. Some campaigns blur into one another. Victories celebrated on coins can conceal months of negotiation, hunger, disease, and retreat. The surviving monuments show what Rome wanted remembered. The private notes show what Marcus needed to remember. At Carnuntum, the great legionary base on the Danube, or in other camps across the northern provinces, he wrote in Greek. He wrote after hearings, marches, reports, sacrifices, and meetings with officers. He wrote while surrounded by men whose lives depended on commands issued from his tent. One part of his notebook was marked as written among the Quadi near the river Granua. Another referred to Carnuntum. These simple locations place philosophy in a landscape of war. The pages do not read like the memoir of a victorious general. Marcus rarely described battles. He did not list enemies killed, cities taken, or honors received. He did not explain strategy to future historians. Instead, he told himself not to become angry with difficult people. He reminded himself that soon both the remembered and the one who remembers would be gone. He warned himself that praise from future generations had no real weight. He urged himself to perform the work of a human being. Morning was a battle before the battlefield. When he resisted leaving his bed, he told himself that he had been born to do the work of humanity, not to remain warm beneath blankets. He considered the activity of plants, birds, ants, spiders, and bees, each performing its part in the order of nature. Why should a human being refuse the work appropriate to a human being? This was not a productivity slogan. For Marcus, human work meant rational and social duty. A person belonged to a larger whole, as a limb belonged to a body. To act selfishly was to cut oneself away from nature. To act justly was to cooperate with the community of rational beings. That belief mattered on the frontier. The emperor could not choose the weather, the enemy's movement, the arrival of illness, or the loyalty of every officer. He could choose how to judge these events and how to respond. He tried to separate impression from truth. A fort had fallen. The first impression said disaster. Reason asked what could be done. A senator insulted him. The first impression said revenge. Reason asked whether the insult changed his character. Pain entered his body. The first impression said suffering was unbearable. Reason asked whether pain could force him to become unjust. Stoicism did not claim that pain was pleasant or that loss was unreal. It argued that neither pain nor loss possessed the power to make a person morally bad without that person's cooperation. The only true evil was corruption of character. The only true good was virtue expressed through wisdom, justice, courage, and self-control. Everything else was material for action. A storm could become material for courage. An insult could become material for patience. Power could become material for justice. War could become material for duty, though the moral certainty of that conclusion is more difficult for modern readers and was not simple even in antiquity. Marcus was still a Roman emperor. His philosophy did not lead him to reject empire, abolish slavery, or abandon war. He believed Rome had obligations to defend its provinces and punish those who violated agreements. He accepted hierarchy, conquest, and institutions that caused enormous suffering. The philosopher emperor was not a modern humanitarian accidentally born in the 2nd century. He was a man of his world, trying to become better within assumptions he rarely questioned. This makes him more complicated, not less interesting. During the Northern Wars, Roman forces gradually recovered. Aquileia survived. The invaders withdrew from Italy. The legions crossed the Danube and carried war into enemy territory. Campaigning in that region demanded endurance. Forests limited visibility. Rivers flooded. Roads became mud. Winter froze the ground, while spring thaw destroyed movement. Supplies had to travel through narrow routes. Horses weakened. Men developed fever, infected wounds, and exhaustion. The enemy could avoid a large battle, disappear among settlements, then strike exposed columns. Marcus relied on experienced commanders. He listened to reports and coordinated different armies across a wide theater. He negotiated when useful and fought when negotiation failed. Tribal leaders came before him seeking terms, accusing rivals, offering hostages, promising captives, and asking permission to settle within imperial territory. Every agreement created another problem. Where would surrendered people live? Who would guard them? Could they be recruited? Would their children remain loyal? Could Rome trust a king who had changed sides twice? The frontier was not solved by victory. It was managed through a cycle of force, diplomacy, trade, hostage exchange, settlement, and threat. In 172, Marcus received the title Germanicus after success against the Marcomanni and their allies. Coins and official monuments celebrated divine favor and imperial strength. But one episode from the war became more famous than any ordinary victory. A Roman force, perhaps including the 12th Legion, found itself in desperate danger during a campaign against the Quadi. The soldiers were exhausted by heat and thirst. The enemy surrounded them. Then the sky changed. Rain fell upon the Romans. A violent storm struck their opponents. The trapped army survived. What happened next was not one story, but several. Roman imperial imagery presented the event as supernatural rescue. On the column later raised in Rome to commemorate the wars, a vast rain god spreads across the scene, water pouring from his body over Roman soldiers while enemies are overwhelmed. Cassius Dio, writing later, associated the miracle with an Egyptian magician who invoked divine power. Christian authors claimed that Christian soldiers had prayed and that their god answered. Other traditions credited Jupiter or the emperor's piety. The storm itself may have been real. Sudden weather can transform battle. But the competing explanations reveal something larger. Everyone wanted the rain. Not merely the water, but the meaning. For imperial religion, the storm proved the gods favored Marcus. For Christians, it proved the power of their prayers. For later storytellers, it showed nature bending around a righteous ruler. Marcus himself does not appear to have made the event central to his private philosophy. He did not need a miracle to prove that nature possessed power. Every day already proved it. The war continued. The Quadi were forced into terms, then rebelled or changed rulers. Marcus intervened in their leadership. The Marcomanni returned captives. Conditions restricted access to markets and movement near the river. Rome demanded hostages and military service. Then attention turned toward the Iazyges, a Sarmatian people known for cavalry and settled on the plains between the Danube and Tisza rivers. Fighting mounted warriors in open country required different tactics from campaigning in forests and hills. Roman infantry remained formidable, but the Iazyges could move rapidly, avoid contact, and attack supply lines. The war was bitter. According to one account, a battle occurred on the frozen Danube. Sarmatian cavalry attacked across the ice, expecting their horses and mobility to give them advantage. Roman soldiers formed close ranks, locked shields, and fought carefully on the slippery surface. Some seized the reins of enemy horses and dragged riders down. The image is vivid, though ancient battle narratives often sharpen events into dramatic scenes. By 175, the Iazyges were compelled to negotiate. They returned a large number of Roman prisoners. They accepted restrictions and provided troops. Thousands of Sarmatian cavalrymen were sent into Roman service, and a substantial group was posted far away in Britain. The movement was deliberate. Rome often separated surrendered warriors from their homeland, turning former enemies into imperial soldiers at the opposite edge of the world. A horseman born on the plains beyond the Danube might end his life beneath the gray skies near Hadrian's Wall. The empire moved people as it moved grain and weapons. Victory seemed near. Marcus may have considered creating new provinces north of the Danube, sometimes called Marcomannia and Sarmatia in modern reconstructions. Evidence suggests ambitious plans, but how close he came to permanent annexation remains uncertain. Then, at the moment military pressure was beginning to succeed, a message arrived from the east. Marcus Aurelius was dead. At least, that was the rumor. He was not dead. But before the truth could cross the empire, one of Rome's most powerful generals made himself emperor. Avidius Cassius had saved the Eastern War years earlier. He had commanded armies against Parthia, restored discipline, and built extraordinary influence in Syria and Egypt. He was experienced, respected, and close enough to the imperial family to understand its vulnerabilities. In the spring of 175, Cassius was proclaimed emperor. Why he acted remains uncertain. A false report may have announced Marcus's death. Some later sources blamed Faustina, claiming she feared what would happen if Marcus died before Commodus was secure and secretly encouraged Cassius. That accusation fits the ancient habit of explaining political crisis through a supposedly scheming woman, and it is not reliable enough to accept as fact. Cassius may have believed Marcus was dead. He may have acted before confirming it. He may have already desired the throne. Whatever the motive, the result was rebellion. Syria and Egypt recognized him. Control of Egypt was especially dangerous because its grain fed Rome. If shipments stopped, political panic could reach the capital quickly. Marcus now faced the possibility of civil war while still campaigning beyond the Danube. This was the nightmare every Roman emperor feared. Foreign enemies could be defeated without destroying the state. Civil war turned Roman legions against Roman legions. It encouraged governors to choose sides, cities to calculate survival, and ambitious men to discover principles after armies had already moved. Marcus addressed his soldiers. The speech preserved by Cassius Dio may not reproduce his exact words, but it reflects the reputation that followed him. He is presented not as raging against betrayal, but as grieving that he might lose the chance to forgive. He hoped Cassius would not be killed. He wanted, if possible, to show mercy to the man who had taken the imperial title. Whether Marcus would truly have pardoned him can never be proven. Emperors often spoke of clemency while their officials understood the demands of survival. Yet Marcus's later treatment of the rebels' family supports the possibility that his restraint was genuine. He ended the northern campaign on terms that allowed him to move east. Preparations began for a confrontation that could divide the empire. But the civil war ended before Marcus arrived. Cassius's own officers killed him after roughly 3 months of rebellion. His severed head was sent to Marcus. The emperor refused to look at it. He ordered it buried. Cassius's family was largely spared. His children were not exterminated. His property was not used as an excuse for a wider bloodbath. Papers that might have named supporters were reportedly burned without being read, protecting others from investigation. The rebellion had offered Marcus the most tempting form of power, the power to punish with public approval. He chose restraint. Yet the crisis had revealed how fragile imperial unity remained. A rumor of one man's death had almost created 2 Roman worlds. Marcus continued east after the death of Avidius Cassius. The rebellion was over, but authority still needed to be seen. Cities had supported the usurper. Governors had hesitated. Armies had sworn new oaths. Egypt, one of the empire's most important provinces, had briefly belonged to another emperor. A letter announcing peace could not repair everything. Marcus had to travel through the regions himself, receive delegations, judge cases, confirm loyalties, and show that the ruler they had been told was dead remained very much alive. He did not travel alone. Faustina accompanied him, as she had accompanied him during other journeys and campaigns. Commodus was with the imperial party as well, no longer a child but a young heir being displayed to the empire he might someday rule. The road carried them through Asia Minor toward Syria. Every arrival was political theater. City councils prepared speeches. Priests organized ceremonies. Crowds gathered. Local leaders presented crowns, petitions, and carefully arranged loyalty. Marcus listened to praise he had repeatedly warned himself not to value. The contrast must have been exhausting. In public, he was the victorious Augustus, protected by the gods and obeyed by nations. In private, he wrote that human fame was noise made by people who would soon be dead. The eastern cities were among the richest and most sophisticated in the Roman world. Greek remained the language of education and culture across much of the region. Temples, theaters, baths, libraries, and colonnaded streets testified to centuries of urban life. Marcus, educated in Greek philosophy, moved through a landscape intellectually familiar to him even when politically uncertain. At Antioch, the great Syrian metropolis, he faced a city that had supported Cassius. Later traditions claim he punished Antioch by limiting privileges and public entertainments, then restored them. The precise details are difficult to separate from moralized biography, but Marcus did not destroy the city or unleash collective revenge. He went farther south to Egypt. Alexandria was unlike any other city in the empire. Greek in foundation, Egyptian in setting, Roman in government, and connected by sea to the Mediterranean world, it was a place of scholarship, trade, religious diversity, and political volatility. Its harbor received ships beneath the memory of the Great Lighthouse. Its streets held Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Romans, merchants, sailors, officials, laborers, and philosophers. Egypt's grain made its loyalty essential. Marcus traveled through the province and appeared before communities that had accepted Cassius's rule. He chose reconciliation over spectacle. The empire had lost enough people to plague in war. It did not need another cycle of executions. Then the journey brought personal loss. In 175, Faustina died at Halala, a settlement in Cappadocia near the Taurus Mountains. She had been Marcus's wife for about 30 years. She had shared the palace, the births and deaths of children, the long preparation under Antoninus Pius, the beginning of the joint reign, the plague, and the northern campaigns. She had traveled closer to the armies than many imperial women before her and received the title Mother of the Camps. Ancient gossip treated Faustina harshly. Stories accused her of affairs with sailors, gladiators, and powerful men. Some claimed she had conspired with Avidius Cassius. The most sensational tales were repeated because they created a dramatic contrast between a virtuous philosopher and an unfaithful wife. But hostile stories about imperial women were common, especially when those women possessed visibility and influence. The evidence against Faustina is weak and shaped by later moral judgment. Marcus's own conduct gives no sign that he regarded her as a disgrace. He mourned her. He requested divine honors for her. The place where she died was renamed Faustinopolis. Charitable foundations associated with her memory supported girls in need. Coins preserved her image. The philosopher who wrote that death was natural did not behave as though the dead meant nothing. Acceptance was not indifference. To accept that a loved one was mortal did not erase the life shared with that person. It meant refusing to demand that nature make an exception. Marcus's grief joined a long list of private losses hidden beneath imperial titles. Several children had died. Antoninus Pius was gone. Lucius Verus was gone. Fronto would also die during Marcus's reign, after suffering losses within his own family during the plague. The world around Marcus was becoming a landscape of absences. From Egypt, the imperial party moved back north and west. In 176, Marcus visited Athens, the city that represented the philosophical inheritance he loved most. He was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, ancient rites associated with Demeter and Persephone, death, renewal, and hope beyond ordinary understanding. Initiates were sworn to secrecy, so the experience cannot be reconstructed in detail. For Marcus, the ceremony may have offered religious meaning after rebellion and grief. It also had political value. A Roman emperor honoring Greek traditions affirmed his place within the cultural world of the Eastern Empire. He supported education in Athens and established or funded chairs in major philosophical schools. Philosophy, in his vision, was not decoration for the court. It was a disciplined way of life and a public inheritance worthy of institutional support. Yet philosophy in the ancient world was not one united doctrine. Stoics, Platonists, Aristotelians, and Epicureans disagreed about nature, the soul, knowledge, pleasure, providence, and the highest good. Marcus drew most deeply from Stoicism, especially Epictetus, but he also quoted or admired ideas from other traditions when they served a moral purpose. He was less interested in defending a school than in transforming himself. Again and again, he returned to the present moment. The past no longer existed. The future had not arrived. Only the action immediately before him could be made just. This thought was not an escape from responsibility. It was a way to make responsibility bearable. An emperor confronted thousands of unresolved matters. If he tried to carry the entire future at once, he would collapse beneath imagination. If he focused on the next honest judgment, the next necessary order, the next patient conversation, duty became possible. He also practiced what later readers call the view from above. He imagined looking down upon cities, households, armies, marriages, births, feasts, arguments, funerals, markets, and ships. From above, the ambitions that consumed individuals became small movements within a larger pattern. Men fought for rooms, offices, titles, and applause, then disappeared. New people repeated the same desires with different names. The exercise was not meant to prove that life was meaningless. It was meant to restore proportion. A single insult felt enormous when the mind stood inches from it. Seen within the history of the world, it became almost nothing. A political rival seemed permanent until Marcus remembered the emperors before him, the courts that praised them, and the silence that followed. Alexander the Great and his mule driver, he observed, came to the same end. The thought stripped death of rank. It also stripped power of fantasy. Marcus returned to Rome in late 176 and celebrated a triumph for victories in the north. The city received him with the full language of empire. Processions, honors, and monuments turned years of mud, disease, negotiation, and fear into a clean story of conquest. Beside him stood Commodus. The boy born on the last day of August in 161 had grown into a teenager. He had already received titles, appeared in military dress, and been placed before soldiers and citizens as the future of the dynasty. His twin brother had died young. Another brother, Lucius Verus, also died in childhood. Commodus survived. In 177, Marcus made him co-emperor. This decision would overshadow nearly every judgment later generations made about Marcus Aurelius. For almost a century, the Roman Empire had experienced a sequence of successions often described as adoption of the best man. Nerva adopted Trajan. Trajan adopted Hadrian, though the exact circumstances were controversial. Hadrian arranged the adoption of Antoninus, who adopted Marcus and Lucius. The pattern has sometimes been imagined as a wise system in which each emperor calmly selected the most capable successor. Reality was more complicated. Several of those emperors lacked surviving biological sons. Adoption solved a practical problem and often confirmed relationships already shaped by family, marriage, and elite politics. It was not a constitutional merit competition. Marcus was the first emperor in this sequence to have a surviving son when the succession had to be decided. Passing over Commodus would have carried danger. A biological son of the emperor could become a rival even without official support. Armies might proclaim him. Courtiers might use him. Any adopted successor would have to live beside a young man whose bloodline offered an alternative source of legitimacy. Eliminating Commodus would have violated Marcus's character and endangered the dynasty. Exiling him might only move the threat elsewhere. Marcus therefore did what Roman emperors had often done before the adoption era. He prepared his son to inherit. At the time, Commodus's later conduct was not fully knowable. He was young. Ancient reports of his cruelty in childhood may have been exaggerated after his reign, when writers searched backward for signs of the monster he would become. Marcus surrounded him with teachers, governors, advisors, and experienced officials. He brought him on journeys and introduced him to military life. The decision was not irrational. It was still disastrous. This is one of history's most uncomfortable lessons. Wisdom does not grant knowledge of the future. A father can understand human weakness and still misjudge his son. A ruler can make a defensible decision that produces terrible consequences. Marcus knew that character mattered more than blood. But blood had political power of its own. The empire celebrated the new partnership. Coins displayed father and son. The Senate accepted Commodus as Augustus. The army saw continuity. After years of plague and rebellion, stability had immediate value. Yet those who met the young co-emperor may have sensed a difference. Marcus treated authority as a burden to be disciplined. Commodus increasingly seemed to experience it as permission. The conflict between those two visions had not yet reached its final form. Another issue complicates the image of Marcus as a ruler of justice. The treatment of Christians during his reign. Christian communities existed across the empire, still a minority and diverse in organization and belief. Roman officials did not always pursue them systematically, and there was no single continuous empire-wide policy of persecution. But Christians could be denounced, questioned, pressured to sacrifice to the gods, imprisoned, tortured, and executed under existing legal practices. The philosopher Justin was executed in Rome during the reign of Marcus. In 177, a brutal persecution occurred at Lugdunum and Vienna in Gaul, where Christians were imprisoned and killed after public hostility and official proceedings. There is no solid evidence that Marcus issued a universal order commanding the persecution of Christians, nor is there evidence that he intervened to stop every local action carried out in his name. His private writings include a dismissive reference to those who faced death through what he regarded as mere stubbornness or theatrical display, possibly aimed at Christian martyrdom, though interpretation is debated. Marcus was tolerant by some standards of imperial rule, but he was not a modern defender of religious liberty. As Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the Roman state, he participated in traditional religion. Public sacrifice was tied to civic loyalty. Groups that rejected sacrifice could appear not simply different, but hostile to the shared relationship between gods and community. This does not excuse suffering. It places it within the limitations of his moral world. Marcus could recognize the common rational nature of humanity and still fail to understand a persecuted minority. He could value justice and still allow institutions to produce injustice. The contradiction should not be hidden. A truthful portrait does not require a flawless man. It requires a man large enough to contain both wisdom and blindness. And Marcus Aurelius was about to return to the place where both would be tested again. The northern peace was breaking. Peace along the Danube had never been more than an armed pause. The agreements forced upon the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Iazyges were severe. Captives had to be returned. Movement near the river was restricted. Markets could be controlled or closed. Warriors were required for Roman service. Leaders who had once negotiated as allies discovered that Roman victory meant surveillance. Beyond them, new pressures continued to move through Central Europe. A treaty could stop a raid. It could not stop history. By 177, fighting resumed. In 178, Marcus and Commodus left Rome for the northern frontier. The emperor was approaching 60. His hair and beard had grayed. Years of illness, administration, and campaigning had worn down his body. Yet the unfinished war called him back. The journey north led once more through Italy toward the military roads beyond the Alps. Columns of soldiers moved with baggage animals, engineers, armorers, physicians, clerks, servants, and families. Supplies followed from depots. Orders traveled ahead. Governors prepared quarters. Communities along the route were expected to provide food, transport, and labor. Imperial war was not only the movement of armies. It was the movement of an entire temporary world. At camp, the day began before sunrise. Trumpets signaled duties. Guards changed. Officers received reports. Scouts described enemy movement. Engineers inspected bridges and defenses. Animals required water and feed. Sick men waited for treatment. Prisoners were questioned. Envoys arrived under protection. At the center of this activity stood the emperor. Marcus heard military plans, but war did not suspend civil government. Petitions still reached him. Legal cases waited. Provincial appointments required approval. Tax disputes, inheritance questions, accusations against officials, appeals from cities, and requests from individuals crossed the same desk as reports from the frontier. The image of Marcus riding alone in a tent is powerful because it captures the solitude of responsibility. But he was never truly alone. Secretaries, legal advisors, commanders, freedmen, guards, messengers, and members of the imperial household surrounded him. The Roman state functioned through an enormous network of people whose names rarely entered history. Marcus depended on them. He also feared becoming insulated by them. An emperor received information already filtered through rank. A governor softened failure. A courtier exaggerated loyalty. A petitioner shaped suffering into the language most likely to receive help. An officer blamed weather, allies, or dead subordinates. Truth reached the throne tired from travel. Marcus's answer was attention. He reminded himself not to drift through work. He urged himself to examine impressions, identify motives, and act according to justice rather than irritation. He wrote that a ruler should be like a promontory against which waves continually break, standing firm until the water falls calm around it. The metaphor sounds serene. Living it was not. Every wave carried a human demand. His legal record shows persistent interest in procedure, guardianship, the treatment of children, inheritance, the status of slaves, and the responsibilities of officials. Later admirers sometimes described his rule as a broad humanitarian revolution. That goes too far. Roman law remained unequal. Social rank shaped punishment. Slavery remained foundational. Masters retained enormous power. The empire continued to execute, exile, confiscate, and conquer. Yet within that system, Marcus often favored careful judgment over cruelty. He sought to protect wards from dishonest guardians. He paid attention to the rights of children and the administration of charitable institutions. He supported measures that made it easier in some circumstances for enslaved people to obtain freedom when an owner's will had intended it. He limited certain abuses and insisted that legal forms be respected. His reforms did not break the structure. They tried to make the structure less brutal. This distinction matters. It is easy to turn Marcus into either a saint or a hypocrite. Both versions are too simple. He was a conscientious ruler inside an imperial system he believed legitimate. His justice moved to the edge of what he could imagine, not to the edge of what later centuries would demand. During public games, Marcus was said to read or conduct business rather than watch every performance. The story may have been polished to emphasize his seriousness, but it matches his dislike of wasted attention. Romans could interpret such behavior as admirable discipline or as coldness toward popular culture. An emperor had to be seen enjoying what the people enjoyed. Too much distance looked like contempt. Too much enthusiasm looked like vulgarity. Marcus navigated these expectations carefully. He attended ceremonies, granted honors, and funded spectacles, even though his private values resisted their emotional excess. Stoicism did not require him to abandon society. It required him to participate without surrendering his judgment. That was the ideal. Reality was messier. He could become impatient. He could feel exhausted by foolishness. He could resent the demands placed upon him. The Meditations repeatedly warn against anger because anger remained present. At the beginning of one famous passage, Marcus told himself that he would meet interfering, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and unsociable people. He then reminded himself that they behaved this way through ignorance of good and evil, and that they shared the same rational nature as he did. He was not telling himself that difficult people were harmless. He was preventing their faults from becoming his faults. If another person acted badly, Marcus still had to act well. If another person lied, Marcus did not gain permission to lie. If another person insulted him, Marcus's character did not improve through revenge. This was especially important for an emperor because irritation could become law. A private man's anger might wound a household. An emperor's anger could destroy a family, a city, or a province. Marcus had examples of what imperial rage could do. Caligula, Nero, Domitian, and even Hadrian in his darker final years had shown how fear at the center of power could spread outward. Informers multiplied. Senators watched their words. Executions created new conspiracies. The ruler who trusted no one eventually gave everyone reason to hate him. Marcus tried to interrupt that cycle. He allowed the Senate dignity, though the Senate possessed far less real power than its ancient title suggested. He consulted advisors. He accepted frank speech from certain friends. He resisted large-scale purges after rebellion. He did not build his reign around terror. But mercy also carried risk. A pardoned enemy could rebel again. A respected senator could become an alternative emperor. A trusted general could be proclaimed by his troops. Stoic justice did not remove political danger. It required Marcus to face danger without letting fear become his master. The Second Northern Campaign brought renewed success. Roman forces crossed the Danube and occupied enemy territory. Archaeological evidence, inscriptions, and ancient accounts suggest deep operations beyond the frontier. Temporary camps extended into regions of modern Slovakia and the Czech lands. Soldiers wintered on hostile ground. The emperor appears to have intended a lasting settlement, perhaps even the creation of new provinces. One ancient historian claimed that thousands of Roman soldiers were stationed within the territory of the Quadi. Such occupation required constant supply and placed pressure on local communities. Rome was no longer simply defending the river. It was attempting to reshape the political world beyond it. Marcus may have imagined a frontier pushed northward, with Marcomannia and Sarmatia transformed into organized provinces like Dacia under Trajan. The idea was ambitious. It was also expensive. The empire had already endured years of plague. Recruitment strained communities. Coinage showed signs of pressure. The army consumed enormous resources. Every mile of new frontier demanded roads, forts, pay, animals, officers, and settlers. Still, the campaigns continued. Commodus was present, learning the outward forms of military leadership. He appeared before troops, received titles, and shared in victory. The contrast between father and son must have been visible even when official art presented harmony. Marcus lived with restraint because he believed desire became slavery. Commodus loved the arena, physical display, and the emotional power of being watched. Marcus asked what nature required. Commodus increasingly asked what power allowed. Yet in the camp, the future remained hidden. A young prince could mature. Advisors could guide him. Responsibility could deepen him. Marcus may have hoped hardship would accomplish what lectures could not. He had reason to believe education could shape character. His own teachers had shaped him. But education meets limits when the student learns that no one can safely say no. The imperial household itself reflected this danger. Everyone near Commodus had an incentive to please him. A tutor who corrected him risked replacement. A companion who encouraged him gained favor. The more powerful the heir became, the harder honest guidance became. Marcus understood flattery in theory. He could not fully protect his son from it. As the campaign entered 179, Roman victory appeared close. A major battle against the Quadi brought success. Dedications celebrated the emperor and Commodus. The army remained in enemy territory through difficult conditions. Marcus continued to write. He reflected on the speed with which all things pass. He imagined the court of Augustus, with its wives, children, doctors, priests, friends, and flatterers. Every one of them was gone. He thought of Vespasian's court, then Trajan's. Gone. The repetition was deliberate. Power creates the illusion that the present is permanent because so many people organize themselves around it. Marcus tried to see through the illusion before death forced him to. He compared time to a river carrying events past. The moment something appeared, it was already being swept away, and another thing took its place. The river did not pause for emperors. On the Danube frontier, the metaphor was almost literal. Water flowed past forts, boats, bodies, and temporary bridges. The tribes on one bank changed leaders. The Romans on the other changed commanders. Treaties were signed, broken, forgotten, and signed again. Only change remained constant. For Marcus, this did not mean despair. If change belonged to nature, resisting change was resistance to the universe itself. Death was transformation. Decay fed new life. The body returned to elements. Names vanished, but the whole continued. The task was not to survive forever. The task was to play one's part well before leaving the stage. By the beginning of 180, Marcus had played his part for nearly 19 years as emperor. His body was failing, and the final campaign had almost reached its conclusion. The final illness began in March. Marcus was somewhere along the Danube military zone, most likely at Vindobona, the Roman settlement beneath modern Vienna, though some traditions place his death at Sirmium farther southeast. The exact room, the exact symptoms, and even the exact location remain uncertain. Ancient biography often turns the death of an emperor into moral theater. Last words become perfect summaries. Gestures are arranged to reveal character. The dying ruler behaves exactly as later generations believe he should. The stories about Marcus must therefore be approached with care. One account says he recognized the illness as plague and isolated himself to protect others. Another says he stopped eating and drinking, allowing death to come. He may have dismissed friends who wished to remain beside him. He may have spoken calmly about the setting sun, telling those who mourned him to think instead of their own approaching night. Whether or not every phrase was spoken, the atmosphere fits the philosophy he had practiced for decades. Death was not an insult. It was not a failure of government. It was not a punishment imposed upon him alone. It was an event nature had assigned to every living thing. Marcus had often imagined this moment. He told himself that the substance of the body would be dispersed. Breath would cease. Sensation would end. The universe would continue without needing his permission. He had written that a person should leave life as an olive falls when ripe, grateful to the tree that produced it and to the earth that nourished it. Now the image was no longer an exercise. His friends and officers had practical fears. The empire was still at war. The heir was 19 years old. The army knew Commodus, but did not know what kind of ruler he would become. Senators in Rome would begin calculating before official news arrived. Frontier enemies might test the transition. Marcus reportedly commended Commodus to trusted advisors. He may have urged his son to continue the war. Later writers claim the emperor worried about Commodus's character and feared the young man might become like Nero. Such stories may reflect hindsight. By the time historians describe the scene, Commodus's reign had already ended in scandal and murder. It was easy to place prophecy in the mouth of the dying father. What Marcus truly believed during those final days cannot be recovered. He had made Commodus co-emperor 3 years earlier. He had brought him to the frontier. He had invested the dynasty in his survival. Whatever doubts existed, the decision had been made. On the 17th of March in the year 180, Marcus Aurelius died. He was 58. The soldiers mourned him. Commodus became sole emperor without immediate challenge. The Senate deified Marcus, adding him to Rome's official gods. Temples, priests, coins, and ceremonies transformed a man who had repeatedly warned himself against fame into an object of public worship. The contradiction would have been impossible to miss. Marcus had written that the body was only blood, bones, tissue, and breath. Rome declared him divine. He had treated reputation as temporary noise. The state placed his image on monuments. He had reminded himself that even the greatest names fade. His name survived for nearly 2,000 years. Commodus did not continue the northern war with his father's determination. Advisors and officers debated strategy. Some wanted to press the advantage and complete the conquest. Commodus preferred peace and a return to Rome. Peace itself was not necessarily foolish. The war had consumed resources for years. Disease had weakened the population. Permanent annexation beyond the Danube might have created more problems than it solved. A cautious emperor could reasonably decide that the existing frontier was enough. But Commodus's motives and later conduct changed how the decision was remembered. He negotiated terms, withdrew, and returned to the capital. The grand possibility of new northern provinces disappeared. Rome celebrated victory, but the emperor who entered the city was not his father. Commodus became increasingly fascinated with spectacle, especially the arena. He styled himself as Hercules, appeared as a gladiator, renamed institutions and months after himself, and demanded forms of honor that alarmed the Senate. Court politics became violent. Conspiracies produced executions. Favorites rose and fell. In 182, Commodus's sister Lucilla was implicated in a plot against him and eventually killed. The reign did not collapse immediately. The empire's administrative structures remained strong. Experienced officials continued their work. Armies guarded the borders. Cities traded and governed themselves. But the tone at the center changed. Marcus had tried to make power answerable to reason. Commodus made power perform for desire. Ancient senators hated him, and their accounts shaped his reputation. Some stories may be exaggerated. Yet the broad pattern is clear enough. His government became unstable, suspicious, and deeply personal. In the final hours of 192, Commodus was strangled after a poisoning attempt failed. His death opened the year of 5 emperors and a new struggle for control of Rome. This is why Marcus's choice of heir became the dark question attached to his memory. Could he have prevented it? Perhaps another successor would have ruled better. Perhaps passing over Commodus would have caused civil war before Marcus died. Perhaps a chosen general would have killed the prince to secure the throne. Perhaps Commodus might have been managed by stronger advisors if circumstances had differed. History reveals consequences more clearly than alternatives. Marcus could judge only from within his own present. The future remained outside his control, just as Stoic teaching had always warned. Yet responsibility does not vanish simply because certainty is impossible. Marcus chose. Rome lived with the result. His political legacy therefore remained divided. To admirers, he was the last great ruler of a fortunate age, a man of moderation surrounded by disaster. To critics, he was a philosopher who failed at the most important decision of monarchy. To later Christian writers, he could be remembered either as a persecutor or, through legends of the rain miracle, as an emperor indirectly touched by Christian power. To Renaissance humanists and modern readers, he became the voice behind a small book of private discipline. That book survived by a path almost as uncertain as the man's death. Marcus did not arrange the notes for publication. They were written in separate books, probably across different years. Some passages repeat one another. Others break off. Personal names appear without explanation. Philosophical arguments are compressed because the writer already understood the context. Someone preserved the papers. Perhaps a secretary copied them. Perhaps members of the household recognized their value. The earliest clear references appear generations later. Manuscripts were copied through late antiquity and the Byzantine world, where a text could survive only if enough readers considered it worth the labor of reproduction. Every copy introduced danger. Ink faded. Pages tore. Libraries burned. Wars moved through cities. A monk or scholar decided which damaged book deserved another copy and which would disappear. The meditations came close to vanishing. The manuscript tradition is thin compared with many famous ancient works. The first printed edition appeared in the 16th century, long after the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. By then, Marcus's monuments had lived a different life. His great column still rose in Rome, its spiral relief showing soldiers crossing rivers, burning settlements, receiving captives, and surviving the miraculous storm. The scenes celebrated imperial victory. They also preserved the violence that private philosophy rarely described. Most ancient bronze statues were melted down for metal. The monumental equestrian statue of Marcus survived, probably because people in the Middle Ages mistook him for Constantine, the first Roman emperor to support Christianity. A mistake of identity protected the philosopher emperor from the furnace. The bronze ruler sits calmly on horseback, one arm extended. The pose combines authority with restraint. The horse moves, the emperor appears composed. No weapon is raised. The image later stood at the center of the Capitoline design associated with Michelangelo, while the original was eventually moved indoors for protection. It is one of history's great ironies. Marcus survived in bronze because he was believed to be someone else. He survived in writing because private words became public, and the empire he worked to preserve survived him in the West for almost 3 centuries, though not in the form he knew. But the deepest legacy of Marcus Aurelius is not a list of wars or laws. It is the unusual experience of hearing a ruler correct himself. Most monuments tell us what power wanted others to believe. The meditations tell us what power feared becoming. Marcus feared laziness. He feared vanity. He feared anger. He feared that suffering would make him cruel. He feared wasting life in distraction. He feared becoming Caesarized, transformed by the role until nothing human remained beneath the purple. So he wrote reminders. Do the work before you. Do not demand applause. Remember that the person who angers you will die, and so will you. Do not act as though 10,000 years remain. Treat other people as relatives in reason, even when they fail to behave that way. Accept what arrives, but choose your response. These ideas sound simple because Marcus returned to them so often. Living them was the hard part. To understand why those reminders survived, it helps to imagine the pressure beneath them. Before dawn in a frontier camp, the emperor's attendants would prepare lamps, clothing, correspondence, and the first reports of the day. Outside, sentries watched the dark line beyond the defenses. Somewhere across the river, enemy scouts might be doing the same. Marcus opened his eyes in a body that often resisted him. He had not slept enough. His stomach may have hurt. His chest may have felt tight. A campaign bed offered little comfort. The weather could be bitter. The work waiting for him had multiplied during the night. One message reported missing scouts. Another described grain delayed by flooded roads. A governor asked for instructions. A city appealed a tax dispute. An officer accused another officer of cowardice. A prisoner offered intelligence in exchange for mercy. A physician warned that sickness had appeared in a unit. A courier from Rome brought news already weeks old. None of these matters could be answered by a single beautiful idea. Philosophy did not replace logistics. It determined the spirit in which logistics were faced. Marcus's Stoicism began with the conviction that the universe formed an ordered whole. The Stoics believed nature was not a random collection of separate objects, but a living system shaped by rational principle. Human reason was part of that larger reason. To live well meant to live in agreement with nature, not by obeying every impulse, but by fulfilling the rational and social character of humanity. A wolf acted according to its nature by hunting. A vine acted according to its nature by producing grapes. A human being acted according to nature by using reason and contributing to the common good. This is why Marcus connected morality with service. The emperor's work was not valuable because it made him famous. It was valuable when it benefited the whole. The idea also placed limits on pride. Marcus did not create the empire alone. He inherited roads built by forgotten laborers, institutions shaped by generations, armies trained before his birth, and wealth drawn from countless communities. His power existed because other people woke, worked, obeyed, traded, harvested, sailed, recorded, repaired, and fought. He was not the body. He was one part of it. Even the highest office was a function, not a separate species of being. This thought may explain the unusual tone of his private writing. He rarely told himself that he deserved comfort because he was emperor. He told himself that being emperor gave him more work to do. Privilege increased obligation. It did not reduce it. Yet the imperial system constantly delivered the opposite message. Courtiers moved when he entered. Crowds cheered. Officials placed his image beside the gods. Provinces dated documents by his titles. Coins carried his face from Britain to Egypt. Men who had never seen him prayed for his health because the stability of their world seemed attached to his body. The danger was not only arrogance. It was unreality. An emperor could begin to believe that his feelings were facts. If he disliked a man, the man must be guilty. If he desired a policy, the policy must be wise. If a crowd applauded, the gods must approve. If no one contradicted him, he must never be wrong. Marcus's notebooks were a defense against this illusion. He reduced himself in his own mind. He pictured his body anatomically, stripping away royal appearance. Purple cloth was sheep's wool dyed with shellfish fluid. Fine wine was fermented grape juice. Sexual attraction could be broken into physical processes. A splendid meal was the flesh of a dead fish, bird, or animal. The exercise can sound severe, even joyless. Its purpose was not to prove that beauty did not exist. It was to break enchantment when beauty became domination. By seeing luxury as material, Marcus hoped to enjoy without addiction and refuse without pain. He applied the same method to fame. Praise was air moved by tongues. Reputation existed inside other people's minds, where he had no control. Future admirers would misunderstand him, just as present admirers did. Why sacrifice character for an image that could never be secured? The argument was especially urgent in Roman political culture. Aristocratic life revolved around honor, memory, ancestry, public office, statues, inscriptions, funeral speeches, and the competition to be remembered. The Roman elite built tombs beside roads so travelers would read their names. Generals celebrated triumphs. Families displayed ancestral masks. Senators treated reputation as a form of immortality. Marcus stood at the summit of this system and told himself immortality through reputation was an illusion. Not because no one would remember him, because remembrance could not belong to him after death. He also questioned the moral value of anger. Roman culture often admired controlled severity in rulers. A general who punished mutiny could be praised. A father who disciplined a household could be called strong. An emperor who avenged insult might claim to defend majesty. Marcus saw anger as a surrender. The person who provoked him could not force him to become furious. Fury entered through judgment. He first decided that the event was unbearable, insulting, or contrary to what should happen. Then emotion followed, changed the judgment, and another response became possible. This did not mean allowing every offense. Marcus could order punishment, wage war, and enforce law. The Stoic ideal required him to do so without hatred, as a physician might treat disease. Correction should protect the whole, not feed the ruler's appetite for revenge. Whether Marcus always achieved this is impossible to know. The very repetition of his warnings suggests he often did not. But failure did not make practice meaningless. A musician repeats scales because skill fades without repetition. An athlete trains because strength is never permanently possessed. Marcus treated philosophy the same way. Each morning began again. The mind had to be trained again. The difficult person had to be understood again. Death had to be accepted again. This is one reason the meditations feel intimate across centuries. They do not present moral life as a door crossed once. They present it as a direction repeatedly recovered. Marcus sometimes lost that direction. He became absorbed in work. He worried about health. He felt grief. He judged others. He could be proud of not being proud. He could turn discipline into another form of vanity. Then he noticed and corrected himself. The notes preserve the correction, not the hidden moment that made correction necessary. Behind every calm sentence may stand an argument, an insult, a sleepless night, a political disappointment, or a fear he did not name. At times he considered the possibility that the universe was governed by providence. At other times, he acknowledged the alternative imagined by automist philosophers. Perhaps events arose from the movement and collision of matter without purposeful design. His moral conclusion remained similar. If providence governed, he should trust the order of nature. If atoms governed, he should still behave justly during the brief life available to him. He did not require certainty about the cosmos before choosing decency. This is one of the quiet strengths of his thought. Marcus was religious, but his ethics did not depend on receiving a personal reward. He did not promise himself that virtue would produce victory, health, or long life. He had seen too much to believe that good people always prospered. The plague killed the dutiful and careless alike. War struck the brave and cowardly. Children died before character could protect them. Justice had to be chosen because justice was the proper use of a rational life, not because the universe guaranteed payment. That principle placed him in conflict with the deepest instinct of power. Power expects results. Marcus tried to judge himself by action. Did he examine the facts honestly? Did he choose the common good? Did he avoid cruelty? Did he perform the duty before him? The outcome mattered politically, but it did not completely determine moral worth. A wise order could fail because a messenger arrived too late. A brave campaign could be defeated by weather. A careful physician could lose a patient. A loving father could raise a destructive son. The final example was the one Marcus would never live to understand. The rest of the empire experienced his reign not as philosophy, but as events. A farmer in Gaul might know the emperor through taxes, recruiters, coins, and rumors of plague. A merchant in Alexandria knew him through grain regulations, customs duties, and portraits displayed in public buildings. A soldier in Britain knew him through pay, orders, and the names attached to military oaths. A captive beyond the Danube knew him as the distant authority behind burned settlements and demanded hostages. A Christian prisoner in Lugdunum knew Roman justice through chains and interrogation. A senatorial family in Rome might know Marcus as a ruler who listened carefully and did not delight in executions. All these experiences belong to the same reign. No single image can contain them without tension. The golden age remembered after Marcus was never golden for everyone. Rome's stability rested on conquest, extraction, slavery, and inequality. Provincial elites benefited by joining the system. Cities competed for imperial favor. Trade flourished. Law created order. Roads and sea routes connected distant regions. Literature, architecture, religion, and philosophy crossed boundaries. At the same time, mines consumed lives. Armies destroyed communities. Enslaved people lived under ownership. Public punishment could be brutal. Citizenship brought rights, but rights were distributed unevenly. Marcus did not stand outside these contradictions. He ruled them. His greatness, where it existed, came not from escaping his age, but from recognizing that power demanded moral vigilance even when he could not imagine a different world. And his failure, where it existed, came from the boundaries of that imagination. The family at the center of Marcus's life deserves one final look, because empire often turns relatives into symbols and hides the human beings beneath them. Faustina became the loyal wife in official memory and the scandalous wife in hostile rumor. Lucius Verus became either a capable co-emperor or a pleasure-loving contrast to Marcus. Lucilla became an imperial daughter, widow, wife, and later conspirator. Commodus became the son who ruined the father's legacy. Each role is too clean. Faustina spent decades beside Marcus and gave birth repeatedly in an age when pregnancy was dangerous. She traveled with the court and was honored by soldiers. Whatever private tensions existed, Marcus continued to speak of her with affection and respect. Lucius Verus did not possess Marcus's philosophical seriousness, but he helped provide a workable division of imperial labor. The Eastern War was won under his authority. His generals succeeded, and the system of co-rule did not descend into rivalry. Lucilla had grown up in a household where politics and family could never be separated. She was married to Lucius while still young, became Augusta, was widowed, remarried, and later watched her younger brother take the place of supreme power. Her failed conspiracy against Commodus in 182 cannot be excused, but it did not arise from an ordinary family disagreement. In the imperial household, a sibling could become a threat, a spouse could become a claim, and private resentment could become treason. Commodus himself was not born as a completed villain. He was a child who survived when many of his brothers and sisters did not. He grew up surrounded by ceremony and fear. Adults bowed to him before he understood why. His failures were his own, but the environment that shaped him was unlike any normal childhood. Marcus tried to provide teachers and examples. He could not give his son the one experience that had formed him most deeply, long years of waiting without certainty that the throne would ever be his. Marcus spent more than 2 decades beneath Antoninus Pius, learning restraint before receiving absolute authority. Commodus knew from childhood that he was the future. The difference may have mattered more than any lesson. A person who waits for power learns that life exists without it. A person raised inside power may never discover where the self ends and the title begins. This does not remove Commodus's responsibility. It reveals the dangerous design of hereditary rule. The same system that promises stability places the future of millions inside a family relationship. Marcus may have understood every weakness of monarchy except the one he could not escape. He was a father. The Roman world after his death continued to invoke his memory. Later emperors sought association with the Antonine name. Some adopted the name Marcus Aurelius to claim legitimacy. Rulers who behaved nothing like him used his reputation because reputation had political value even when philosophy did not. His reign became a measuring stick. A moderate emperor could be praised as another Marcus. A tyrant could be condemned by contrast. The comparison was often less about historical accuracy than about longing. Rome's later crises made the 2nd century appear calmer and more prosperous than it had felt to those who lived through plague and war. Memory softened suffering. It also sharpened the break with Commodus. Cassius Dio, who lived through the transition and later served in public life, described Marcus with profound admiration. His famous judgment that history descended from gold into iron and rust after Marcus's death shaped generations of interpretation. The phrase is powerful because it feels like a door closing. But history rarely changes in a single instant. The empire under Marcus already faced problems that would continue. Pressure on the frontiers, dependence on military loyalty, epidemic disease, financial strain, and uncertainty over succession. Commodus intensified some dangers and neglected others, but he did not create them all. The Golden Age contained iron beneath the surface. Marcus's death did not destroy Rome. It removed one ruler who had spent his life holding contradictions in balance. His philosophy also underwent transformation. For ancient Stoics, philosophy involved logic, physics, ethics, training, community, and a complete understanding of nature. Modern readers often encounter Marcus through isolated lines placed on walls, social media images, business manuals, athletic speeches, or guides to personal resilience. The appeal is understandable. His words can steady a person facing anxiety, insult, grief, or uncertainty. They speak directly because they were originally direct commands from a man to himself. But something is lost when Stoicism becomes only emotional invulnerability. Marcus did not teach that feelings should be buried. He mourned. He loved. He struggled. He did not teach that success proved superior discipline. He watched worthy people die and bad events arrive without justice. He did not teach selfish indifference. His philosophy was social. The human being existed to cooperate, contribute, forgive, and act for the common good. A person who uses Stoicism only to become harder has missed Marcus's central concern. The goal was not hardness. It was goodness that remained stable under pressure. A stone does not feel anger, but it cannot act justly. Marcus wanted the steadiness of the stone without losing the responsibility of the human being. He also understood that mortality gives urgency to morality. If life continued forever, postponement would be easy. A person could delay courage, honesty, forgiveness, and work for another century. But the day ends. The campaign ends. The reign ends. The breath ends. Therefore, the present action matters. Not because it will be remembered forever, but because it is the only place character can exist. Marcus frequently examined death from different angles, as though turning an object in his hands. Death was a natural process. Death was the end of sensation. Death was transformation. Death was shared by emperors, physicians, conquerors, philosophers, and fools. Death made fame absurd. Death made resentment wasteful. Death made kindness urgent. Some readers hear sadness in these reflections. Others hear liberation. Marcus did not tell himself that nothing mattered because everything ended. He told himself that only certain things mattered because everything ended. Wealth could not be kept. Applause could not be kept. The body could not be kept. But the choice to act with justice existed fully in the moment it was made. It required no immortality. This philosophy was tested most deeply by loss. When a child died, nature had taken what nature had given. That statement can sound cold to anyone inside grief. Marcus likely knew that. He did not write as an observer untouched by pain. His family had lived through repeated funerals. Stoic acceptance did not forbid tears. It resisted the belief that love entitled a person to permanence. To love a mortal being was to love under the condition of change. That condition is not a defect added later. It is part of the love from the beginning. Marcus's marriage ended with Faustina's death. His friendship with Fronto ended. His partnership with Lucius ended. His relationship with Antoninus ended. His own life ended. Yet the ending did not make those relationships meaningless. Their meaning existed in how they shaped his character and actions while they were present. This may be the most humane reading of his acceptance. Do not love less because loss will come. Love without demanding ownership over time. The same lesson applied to Rome. Marcus knew the city was not eternal in any literal sense, even when official language called it so. He remembered vanished kingdoms and ruined courts. He knew that history had swallowed the power of Egypt, Persia, Macedonia, and the Roman Republic itself. The empire would change. Its borders would move. Its language would divide. Its religion would transform. Its Western government would one day disappear. He could not prevent all of that. He could preserve order for one reign. He could pass laws, command armies, appoint officials, and leave an heir. He could not make Rome exempt from nature. No wall is permanent. No dynasty is permanent. No golden age is permanent. The Stoic emperor ruled not by denying this truth, but by trying to work faithfully inside it. That is why the image of him at the Danube remains so powerful. He was surrounded by everything Rome built to resist change: armor, forts, standards, titles, laws, monuments, and disciplined ranks. And at night, he wrote that change could not be resisted. He commanded soldiers to hold the frontier while reminding himself that no frontier lasted forever. He defended an empire while accepting that all empires pass. He loved a son while failing to see what that son would become. He sought wisdom without claiming to possess it. The greatness of Marcus Aurelius lies not in perfection. It lies in the struggle to remain human when the world gave him every opportunity to become something worse. Centuries after his death, visitors to Rome would stand beneath the spiral column raised in his honor and see a version of Marcus very different from the man in the notebook. Stone soldiers march upward around the monument. Rivers are crossed. Forts appear. Villages burn. Captives are brought before the emperor. Women and children are driven from defeated communities. Roman formations advance beneath standards. The mysterious rain pours from the sky. At intervals, Marcus appears larger in meaning than in size. He addresses troops, receives envoys, judges prisoners, and presides over the machinery of conquest. The column does not show him waking reluctantly in the cold. It does not show him doubting praise. It does not show grief for his children or the private effort required to control anger. Monuments simplify. They turn uncertainty into victory and suffering into sequence. The notebook does the opposite. It breaks victory apart and asks what remains when titles are removed. Together, the column and the meditations form one of the most revealing pairs left by the ancient world. One shows how empire wanted power to look. The other shows how power tried to govern itself. Neither is complete without the other. A reader who sees only the philosopher may forget the armies. A viewer who sees only the conqueror may never hear the moral struggle. Marcus Aurelius was both. He belonged to the Roman tradition of commanders, magistrates, priests, fathers, slave owners, and aristocrats. He also belonged to a philosophical tradition that asked whether any external achievement could compensate for a damaged soul. He never escaped that tension. Perhaps no ruler can. Power requires decisions that affect strangers. Philosophy asks the decision-maker to recognize those strangers as participants in the same human order. Empire divides people into citizen and foreigner, free and enslaved, ruler and ruled. Stoicism insists that reason makes humanity a kind of universal city. Marcus held both ideas at once. Sometimes the emperor defeated the philosopher. Sometimes the philosopher restrained the emperor. The wars continued, but revenge did not consume the state after the rebellion of Cassius. The legal hierarchy remained, but some vulnerable people received greater protection. Traditional religion remained official, but philosophy taught him to see humanity as connected. Commodus inherited, but Marcus spent years attempting to prepare him. These outcomes were imperfect because the man was imperfect. The enduring power of his life comes from that imperfection being visible. He did not write, "I have become patient." He told himself to be patient. He did not write, "I no longer fear death." He returned to death again and again. He did not write, "Other people cannot disturb me." He developed methods for the moments when they did. Every repetition is evidence of struggle. and every struggle brings him closer to us than the bronze face suggests. The statue on horseback presents a ruler beyond hesitation. His arm extends over the space before him. The horse raises one hoof. The composition is balanced, calm, commanding. The man who sat for such images knew balance was never permanent. It had to be recreated with each judgment. A person could behave wisely at sunrise and foolishly by noon. A ruler could show mercy after one rebellion and become harsh during another crisis. A father could teach discipline and still indulge hope. Character was not a possession locked safely inside the self. It was an activity. This idea may explain why Marcus cared so much about attention. A distracted person lives through habit, rumor, appetite, and reaction. An attentive person creates a small space between event and response. Inside that space, freedom becomes possible. A soldier reports failure. Pause. A rival insults you. Pause. Pain rises. Pause. The crowd praises you. Pause. The mind produces an impression, but judgment does not have to obey immediately. Marcus had more external freedom than almost anyone who had ever lived. Yet his philosophy taught him that external freedom was fragile and incomplete. The empire could obey him while anger ruled his mind. Servants could remove every inconvenience while desire made him dependent. Armies could protect his body while fear imprisoned him. Real command began inside. That is the hidden meaning behind the title Philosopher Emperor. It does not mean a philosopher happened to receive a throne. It means the throne became the greatest test of whether philosophy was real. A poor man can believe he is indifferent to luxury because luxury is unavailable. An obscure man can claim indifference to fame because no crowd knows his name. A powerless man can condemn revenge because revenge is beyond his reach. Marcus possessed luxury, fame, and the power to punish. Refusing them, even imperfectly, required more than theory. He could order palaces expanded. He could confiscate estates. He could fill the Senate with fear. He could demand divine honors during life. He could kill critics and call it security. Other emperors had done so. He generally did not. This restraint is difficult to measure because history records spectacular crimes more easily than crimes never committed. There is no monument to the senator not executed, the property not seized, the insult not avenged, or the accusation not believed. Restraint leaves fewer ruins. Its evidence appears in the tone of a reign, in the survival of opponents, in the confidence of advisors, and in the absence of terror as a governing method. Marcus's reign still contained violence on a vast scale, but violence was not his pleasure. Duty, as he understood it, compelled him toward war. Desire did not make war his identity. The distinction cannot comfort those who suffered Roman invasion. It can, however, help explain the man who ordered it. He did not imagine himself a hero in a simple story. He imagined himself a temporary servant of an order larger than himself. This belief gave him strength. It may also have prevented him from questioning the imperial order deeply enough. A ruler who believes his state expresses reason can mistake obedience to the state for obedience to nature. Marcus's philosophy challenged his ego more than it challenged Rome. That limitation belongs beside his achievements. The most honest legacy is neither worship nor dismissal. It is examination. What happens when a thoughtful person enters a violent system? How much can individual virtue change institutions? When does duty become obedience to inherited assumptions? Can a ruler remain good while commanding an empire built on conquest? Marcus did not answer these questions for every age. He lived them for one life. And because he wrote privately, we can watch him trying. The ancient sources outside his notebook are not always kind or reliable. Cassius Dio admired him, but wrote with senatorial concerns. Herodian lived later and shaped history through moral contrast. The collection known as the Historia Augusta preserves valuable material mixed with invention, gossip, false documents, and literary games. Even the familiar portrait of Marcus must therefore be built carefully. Some beautiful final words may never have been spoken. Some court scandals may never have happened. Some victories may have been less complete than monuments claim. Some acts of mercy may have been polished by admirers. Uncertainty does not destroy the story. It reminds us that history is not direct access to the dead. It is a conversation with fragments. A coin shows a title. A letter shows affection. A legal text shows policy. A column shows propaganda. A skeleton shows disease or injury. A notebook shows a mind speaking to itself, but even that mind chooses what to write and what to leave silent. The complete Marcus Aurelius remains beyond reach. Perhaps he would have approved of that conclusion. He distrusted the certainty with which people judged one another. He knew that human beings saw actions without fully seeing causes. He advised himself to consider what shaped another person's beliefs before becoming angry. The same charity can be extended to him without becoming excuse. We can understand his world and still judge its cruelty. We can admire his discipline and still question his wars. We can value his philosophy and still recognize his failures as a father and emperor. A complex life deserves a complex memory. In the last night of that life, the camp must have continued around him. The frontier did not become silent because an emperor was dying. Guards still walked their routes. Fire still needed fuel. Horses still needed water. Clerks still copied orders. Soldiers still whispered about the succession. Beyond the Roman positions, communities who had fought for years waited to learn whether war would continue. Inside the imperial quarters, breath grew slower. Marcus had once written that a person could leave life at any moment and should let that truth determine every act and thought. Now there were no more acts to prepare, no more petitions to judge, no more armies to direct, no more corrections to write. The titles remained outside the room. Imperator, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus, Sarmaticus, father of the country. None could perform the final task for him. He faced death not as ruler of the world, but as one living being returning to the same nature that produced him. The pulse stopped. The room changed. At that instant, the empire still stretched across continents. Ships still crossed the Mediterranean. Lamps burned in Rome. Grain boats moved along the Nile. Soldiers watched the rain in Britain. Merchants closed shops in Antioch. Families slept in villages whose names history never recorded. Most did not yet know that Marcus Aurelius was dead. For days or weeks, depending on distance, they continued living under the reign of a man who no longer existed. Then messengers arrived. Portraits changed. Oaths changed. Coins changed. The emperor became a god, and the son became emperor. Time moved on exactly as Marcus had said it would. The people who mourned him died. The soldiers who served him died. Commodus died. The senators who condemned Commodus died. The dynasty ended. The language of the empire changed. The gods of the state lost their temples. The western throne disappeared. The camps along the Danube became ruins beneath later cities and fields. Yet somewhere, a copyist opened a manuscript. The words of the dead emperor were placed before another human being facing anger, fear, ambition, grief, and time. The copyist continued. That small decision outlasted legions. It carried Marcus into worlds he could not have imagined. Monasteries, Renaissance libraries, printed books, military packs, prison cells, hospital rooms, classrooms, and quiet bedrooms far beyond the borders of Rome. Readers who possessed no empire recognized the struggle to rise in the morning. People with no army recognized the difficulty of dealing with others. Those facing illness recognized the effort to separate pain from despair. Those grieving recognized the desire to accept what the heart refused to release. The universal part of Marcus was never the throne. It was the resistance within him. The resistance to anger. The resistance to vanity. The resistance to fear. The resistance to wasting the brief moment between birth and death. His victories north of the Danube eventually faded into specialized history. His imperial titles became details on coins and inscriptions. But the private struggle remained familiar. That is the final irony. Marcus Aurelius spent his reign defending the borders of Rome. What survived most powerfully had no border at all. Not the territory, not the dynasty, not the military triumph. A voice, a man reminding himself to become worthy of the day before it disappeared. The watchfires beside the Danube are gone now. The soldiers have vanished. The room in which he died cannot be identified with certainty. But the question he placed before himself remains alive for every generation that finds his words. When power, fear, loss, and time strip everything else away, what kind of person will you choose to be?